Well, we are still in John chapter 6, where Jesus miraculously fed a crowd of 5,000 people, gave them all free bread, and then the next day they were back asking for more. Jesus told them that they were shallow, that he was the bread of life, that he could satisfy their spiritual needs, that they would never go hungry again, never be thirsty again if they would believe in him. Of course, not meaning physical thirst or physical hunger, but the needs of their souls. He spoke repeatedly about the fact that he could give eternal life and that those who trusted in him would be raised up on the last day. But we talked about how this crowd, what they wanted for him was to use his miraculous power to lead a rebellion against the Roman Empire and to keep handing out the free bread. We're going to pick it up today in verse 47. In the middle of some of the words of Jesus, let me read those for you. In verse 47, he says, "Very truly I tell you, the one who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world." Now, in that passage, everything sounds really good until that last sentence. There's this incredible offer of eternal life, and then there's this strange statement that the bread of life is Jesus' flesh and that he's going to offer it to the world. He kind of makes it about his body, and we know that this is a reference to the cross, but of course they didn't. And so some people are going to hear that and they're going to say, wow, that's incredibly good news. But other people are going to hear it and say, that's offensive and kind of strange. And this crowd chose to see it as offensive and strange. They chose to take it literally, as they've been doing throughout this passage, to think about physical things instead of spiritual things. And so they start arguing in verse 52 about how he can give them his flesh to eat. Jesus chooses not to explain that, but actually to repeat it more strongly. So in verse 53 and following, he says, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever." Now that's a confusing passage, and frankly kind of gross if you assume that Jesus is talking about material things, as these people did. Right from the beginning of this conversation, he's made it clear that he's talking about the spiritual world, not the physical world. He's comparing himself to bread. He's saying that what bread does for our body, he can do for our soul. He's saying that believing in him is like eating that bread. In fact, he's used the phrase "believe in me" a couple of times in this passage. So it should be clear to these people, we're not talking about cannibalism. We're talking about trusting in Jesus as our spiritual sustenance. As we believe in him, our souls are fed and we receive eternal life. But they don't get it. It's not clear to them. They can't make the jump to spiritual things. They're still thinking about how cool it would be to have a military general with superpowers. They're still thinking about free bread and lower taxes. So as far as they're concerned, Jesus has now just started talking nonsense. So it says in verse 60, "On hearing this, many of his disciples said, 'This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?'" When it uses the word disciples, it's not talking about the 12 disciples who were also called apostles, who were closest to Jesus, but it is talking about some who for a time were his students. And it says in verse 66 that from this time on, many of them turned back and no longer followed him. Now, as a Christian and as a pastor, of course, I would want everyone to follow Jesus. But it's interesting that Jesus himself was not afraid to say things that offended people and turned them away, because he didn't really want people following him on their terms. Jesus didn't want people to be there if they were just in it for the free bread, if they were just there for the miracles show. He didn't want them to be thinking about earthly benefit. The whole idea of this passage can kind of be summed up in this statement he makes in verse 63. He says, "The Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing." So Jesus offers eternal life. He offers spiritual satisfaction. If that's what you're seeking, then he is the bread that your soul needs. If you're seeking something for your flesh, you may be disappointed. And there's this beautiful statement by Peter at the end of the chapter in which he kind of speaks for all of us who've chosen to follow Jesus for those spiritual reasons. I'll just read that. In verse 67, "You do not want to leave too, do you?" Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God." If it's eternal life you're seeking, there's nowhere else to go. I encourage you to take some time and slowly read through this whole chapter. There's more in there than what we've had time to talk about, but we will pick things up in chapter 7 in the next video.